Hey everybody, we're live. Welcome back. Ida will be joining us momentarily, and John has some very exciting things to say, I'm sure.
Thank you.
That is my pleasure.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear us?
I can hear you.
Yeah, somebody in the chat just put up a thumb.
You guys hear us?
No pressure. That's not an answer. Yes, thank you, Hassan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Oh, hi, Morgan.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Conrad. Hi, everybody. Great. So we have, hi, Blake. And I saw Paul earlier. I see Sam.
Oh my God, all the troublemakers have arrived.
Hi, Sean.
So I just want to start by welcoming everyone. Welcome, everyone. This is our 7th session of the Learning Salon. And specifically, this is a wrap-up session of the last 6 sessions. So we are very excited to discuss with you some kind of a summary of what we think are the main sort of big picture takeaways of the last salons and what we would like to continue talking about. A gentle reminder, the Learning Salon is an attempt to think about together, think about big picture perspectives and opinions and underlying assumptions in biological and artificial learning and their contentions, their differences, their similarities, where they meet, where they diverge. We are extremely privileged to have a fantastic audience with us. And we have had, I think by now, about 1,200 people that have dropped in and out at different times. And I would like to just say, if you're a junior person, so John, can I ask you to?
I'm sorry, I'm just laughing. I'm sorry.
Wait, I wanted to ask you to mute yourself because of your mic, but
No.
sorry.
I feel terrible, honestly.
So terrible. So yeah, he hasn't. You haven't muted yourself yet. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. So okay. So here's what I do want to say. If you're a junior person and you feel like you don't know a lot, and sometimes you feel like you actually know more than people take you to know, this is a place where you can put your knowledge to the test, ask questions, ask for clarifications, and feel like you can engage no matter what level you are at. If you're someone who's usually afraid of asking questions, come on the screen with a fake name, however you want to do it. We want to hear your questions. We want to clarify things. That is a very important goal of ours. And so your questions matter to us, and it matters to us that we give you a voice however you like. If you want to hide your real name, however you like. Another thing I want to say is it's very common to be requested by everyone or trained by everyone to be a career scientist, to care about what is going to get you ahead, focusing on one particular field, or being successful with particular notions of success. And one of the things that we are very fortunate to have this community for is this idea that at the end of the day, we are scientists and we want to think about theories deeply. We want to see what makes sense and what doesn't. We want to clarify things. We want to bring to light some of the underlying assumptions or philosophical, ideological underlying currents that give rise to particular ways of thinking or particular ways of addressing science. In this particular instance, different modes of learning in human and machines. And I hope that you guys, everybody who's there, can see that this is not a place where we want to ambush anyone, or it's the cult of the smartest person in the room, as John called it once. But it's a place where we all come together to think together, to discuss together. It's one thing to be on paper scientists. It's another thing to just, without having any notes or something, or sometimes taking notes so we don't forget each other's points, to just discuss and just see what is in our collective consciousness, in a manner of speaking. What is in our collective memory of what do we know about the field, what is missing, what is going forward. This is a way of like syncing together. And so I hope that words like ambush or things like that I saw on Twitter. I hope people don't use those terms for the salon, because the idea is to think together, to learn together. And that means, sometimes challenging certain ideas or assumptions, or, requesting further clarifications. So with respect and with a lot of kindness to each other, please feel free to do that. Ask for clarifications, ask tough questions, provide challenges, but make sure to be kind and respectful, because this is a salon. And, I was always very inspired by the salons that early 20th century artists and Dadaists had, or, people in various sort of countries in South America had, or a lot of artist communities and philosophy communities and scientist communities around the world. We hope that this is something like that, where we can just talk and rethink things. And so that's something I wanted to say before we start. Okay. Ideally, we could have wine. Yes, Adrian, I wish that this was in person so we could have.
I think you can have wine. We won't stop you. Everyone is welcome. Grab a glass of wine, cozy up.
You're muted, John. You're muted. Oh.
Rightly so.
Oh, shut up. Gosh. I don't know, Ida. I'm talking to Ida. Have you seen that show Fleabag? You're muted now too. Do you remember that when you were talking about career scientists?
Yeah.
My favorite line in Fleabag is when she asks her sister, "You look stressed," and the sister goes, "Yes, I'm successful."
Oh.
So success can be really terrible. Anyway, how are we going to start this? And I hope, look, being part of the salon is maybe start collecting headphones. Do you like my pink sort of new headphones?
Very nice. I don't like the microphone on them, but
Well, okay, great. All right. How do we do this? Should we go with our slides, Ida?
So there's one slide where we have a bigger picture, 3 main crises that we identify in the last 6 sessions. Maybe we can share that. And John, you wanted to give us a summary of what you thought was going on in the last 6 sessions. People, please start to ask questions in the Ask a Question area and vote on each other's question. We're just going to summarize for a minute and give everybody some time, because we don't have a specific speaker. We're just summarizing and allowing everyone to ask their questions.
Okay, so I don't mind doing that.
I'm going to share the slide.
yeah, feel free to start asking questions. People can start voting. And
Yeah, that's just one other thing is, we'll do some little summaries. And then I think we should have everyone in the room just have at it. Just come in and unlike last time, there won't be a large lead in. We just start going at it. Okay. Ida, did you want to do your slide, or do you want me to summarize?
Oh, could Jovo maybe share that once, the three crisis slide? Because I just realized I have one screen and I will not be able to look at anything if I do that.
yeah, I can do it. Sorry, I just have to find my other screens. We're close. We're very close.
John, your previous headphones are receiving love from Conrad.
Conrad always finds a way to make a compliment be actually the reverse. By saying that my previous headphones were cooler. I'm going to deal with him later. Okay.
Everybody can see now?
Go on then, Ida.
Yeah, sure. So maybe one way to summarize very quickly before John gives us maybe a little bit more in-depth summary is that perhaps the 3 crises that we observed in the last 6 sessions could be summarized as crisis of methodology, where what Conrad and other folks, for instance, Adrian, talked about was that understanding failure modes of neuro methods is lacking. And we are incentivized to illustrate their success modes and hide their failure modes, and we need to change our methodology to some extent. The second thing is we heard from Melanie Mitchell, and from a lot of people during the chats and during the discussions also on Twitter, that benchmark chasing doesn't quite get AI common sense. So if we're looking towards artificial general intelligence or machine learning that approximates human cognitive capacities, we're not going to get there just by benchmark chasing, because it's going to lack common sense. So there is a discussion by a number of our previous speakers on Adrian says that my sound is going in and out. John, do you mind muting yourself?
Oh my God.
I'm very sorry. Okay.
It's like John's worst nightmare is having to mute himself.
And then the last one is the crisis of reductionism. And that's when what happens is that people might start to use neurons as explanations as opposed to evidence for a higher level explanation. And I think this also nicely connects to what Adrian had in terms of low D and high D models. And so I feel like it's not that each of these are specific to one or two speakers. A lot of the speakers span across these. So there's a way in which we can't extrapolate from very low-level neural representations to all of cognition. So there's a crisis of understanding the appropriate level of representation or level of explanation when we are talking about sort of different kinds of neuroscientific or machine learning findings. And it's very useful to use rodents or evolutionary sort of approaches or phylogenetic approaches. However, these are not sufficient to explain cognition or get us artificial general intelligence. So while it's useful for us to look at all levels of explanation and think about different levels of evolutionary and biological sort of explanation, it's not sufficient to get all of cognition. As you can see, there is a connection between all of these three. For instance, the idea that connectomics doesn't give us meaning or predict behavior completely or capture entire cognition falls under crisis of methodology, crisis of meaning, crisis of reductionism. So you can think this might be a good summary of just the kinds of challenges, higher level challenges that we are seeing across these 6 past sessions. So with that, I'm going to give it to John because he thought that he could kindly give us some more explanation of the past or some summary of the past.
Thanks, Ida. I'm just going to hold this out like this so you don't get irritated. Okay. Before we came on, Josh, Ida and I were talking about this salon and what it's been like. And Josh said something quite interesting, which is we can all do our neuroscience work and ask questions that are local to what we're doing, but we're not usually challenged on the big picture of what we're doing, right? In other words, we don't really, I remember teaching the neuroscience grad students at Hopkins and asking them why they went into neuroscience. And they went, well, a lot of them said we'd like to understand cognition, and what they mean there is sort of thinking. But then you get into your details, you get into your methodology, you get into the nitty gritty, and you get out of practice having to explain after you've had your interview to get into grad school or wherever, of really trying to sort of embed or contextualize what you're doing. And then what salons like this do is that they make you have to sort of explain why your particular project is the one to get to the big answer, right? So Conrad, who started off the salon, said, look, I'm going to show you that doing nitty-gritty neuroscience on a microprocessor doesn't get you to the big answer of what it does. Now, of course, that led to all sorts of rage, but the point was that sometimes the work that you do no longer is the best way necessarily of getting the big answer that maybe was the reason you got into the field in the first place. Okay. And then I think Conrad has gone on to say, well, maybe we need a better way to have a congruence between our big question and our methods, and maybe they've diverged. Okay. And then, Adrian came on, and I think Adrian, but because she's so ecumenical and has worked at so many different levels, I would say that some people don't feel the same tension because they're not necessarily worried about one big question, but they're willing to show ingenuity and be more local with their questions with respect to the particular system they're currently working on. So and Adrian, of course, is here today so she can answer back, but I think she's more pluralistic in the questions that bother her. And so it's not the mismatch between the way you're doing your work and the big question is less acute. Melanie came on and she goes straight to something which I think all of us, worry about when it comes to AI, which is it just feels like that declarative reasoning meaning machine that we all are, and we're all manifesting that strange capacity right now on this, on this salon. It's just like the elephant in the room that is so huge that there are various ways to try and either admit that it's a mystery, like Melanie does and others, or sort of try and deflate it somehow. And we'll get to sort of attempts to deflate it in a minute. So I think Melanie is worried about something very, very big. And I feel intuitively that it's huge. And I have no idea whether from the neuroscience side or the AI side, how to bridge the meaning gap that Melanie talked about. It does seem like a strange, a bridge too far. Then, and tell me guys if I get anything, we had Tony on, right? Was Tony the next? Yes. So Tony, in the sort of, in my view, slightly deflationist mode, feels that if we could just look at the circuitry of a lower mammal, that we would have some moment, and he said it while he was on, to his credit, that somehow if you just looked at the circuitry and the connectome, that there would be some moment of insight, some sort of canonical truth that would reveal itself from the physiology and anatomy of the mouse that would lead to a moment of remarkable extrapolation to cognition. Okay. Then we had, who was next? Was it Paul? No, who was after Tony? Oh, no, it was Marcin.
Yeah.
So Marcin actually, interestingly, going in the reverse direction from deflationism, actually talked about that the demise of the computational theory of mind, of cognition, had been exaggerated. And people like Marcin and other people in the philosophy of mind literally state that if you're going to have a computational theory of mind, you have to, by definition, have a substrate independent account. Okay. Now it's very important not to mistake substrate independent accounts of cognition without believing in what they call physical computation. In other words, they do feel that ultimately will have to cash out in some way with physical degrees of freedom that may or may not be neural. Okay, so it's quite a subtle position, which is that the computational theory of mind requires a substrate independent account, but that doesn't mean that it should be completely free of physical accounts, which is quite interesting. Then Paul is another kind of deflationist who feels like if you incrementally, from the Cambrian explosion onwards, have an account of the sensory motor system, then in some way you will be able to sort of not have to come up with a computational / representational substrate independent theory of mind. Now, of course, I completely disagree with that. And I think the AI field has to also. And I also agree with Marcin, who in his book says he has no idea really what a non-information processing view of cognition would actually be. And he's quite funny about it in his book. And so there we are. We've got people who care about a big question and worry about the gap. Conrad is one, Melanie's another. There are people who want to sort of go away from worrying about human cognition, either by extrapolation from a mammal that's smaller or just denying that there's a cognitive problem at all. And then there are people who are more interested in asking more local questions without being deeply worried about this cognitive gap. And so I think that's really what's been going on here, is how worried are you and how real is this problem, and what's the best way to tackle it, theoretically, through AI, or through neuroscience. And so that's what happened. I hope that I was sufficiently simplistic and unfair to all of your positions, so those of you who are here can jump into the room and clarify, and I'll stop there.
I just want to say, Paul is saying, I don't think the summary of my view was good.
Of course he would. Yeah, but Paul is a deflationist. He's just got to admit it. But he can always come in and explain himself. All right. So who wants to...
So we can start looking at the question area, and we can kind of prioritize maybe our former speakers at some point, oh no, we already have votes for questions. So should we start with the questions? Or Jovo, do you want to say something before?
I love you guys.
But we didn't give you a chance to make perhaps your summary. You did a great job of talking to us an hour before about your summary. So
I think you guys did a great job. I think I want to hear what other people say, and I'll fight you guys later throughout rather than now.
So we're gonna start calling people's names to come on the screen and talk to us if that's okay. So the first question is Jonathan Flowers. Are you here? Would you like to? Jovo, could you invite him on stage? What is it? On screen? Living room?
Into the living room. He has been invited.
Hello.
Hey, welcome back.
Hi, welcome back. You seem to, we didn't see you for a couple of sessions.
Yeah, I had to teach.
How selfish.
Jobs.
All right.
These things happen. So generally, my question is whether or not computational models or metaphors of the brain broadly in the mind, more specifically, hinder development in our respective fields. So this, I think this gets us into questions of, is the brain just a biological computer, or are the functions of the brain analogous to the structures of any kind of computational system, things like that. So this is more the thrust of my question. Is the very metaphor we use broadly across our fields hinder the ways we can develop different technologies or different understandings?
I have a strong opinion I'd be happy to share about that. And so my perspective really comes from the kind of statistical machine learning perspective on models, in the sense that models essentially give us a lens through which to explore the world. And there's a bias with that. So insofar as the model is inaccurate, it leads us in the wrong direction. However, the plus side of the model is that it reduces the variance. Rather than all possible things being worth explaining, the model gives us like a much smaller set of things that we want to explain. And so in any kind of analysis, there's always this bias variance trade-off. And so if we have a good model, it really helps. And if we have a bad model, it really hurts. And so that's why I think it's really fundamental, just like what Ida and John were saying, to really investigate what we mean when we have a model, and what are the implications of that model? What are the limitations specifically of that model? Which, as Ida pointed out, we're hardly at all incentivized to really make clear. Like, no one accepts our papers because we point out so clearly the limitations of our approach, right? That's not something that we thrive on as a community. So I think that is something that we really need to get better at, not just in neuroscience and AI, but probably collectively as a species. We want to understand our limitations more effectively. We can find our blind spots and then improve our models. I think without the models, we're going to be in a bad a bad way. There's just too much variance and everything could be explained.
I just want to say maybe that was a great answer, but might be a little different from the answer to a question that was asked. The question, I'm going to read the question again, is do computational models or metaphors of the brain broadly and the mind specifically hinder further development in our respective areas? John, I don't know, you just put on your headphones, so I'm going to repeat the question. Do computational models or metaphors of the brain broadly and the mind specifically hinder further development in our respective areas? So for a philosopher, for instance, if everything about the mind becomes computationalized, for an anthropologist, is if everything about the mind turns into sort of computational methods, it could potentially hinder them, right? So I think that's the question that is being asked. Whether, so if, for instance, if I was an anthropologist, I would be going around different parts of the world seeing what metaphors people have been using for the mind. Maybe if I was like a philosophical anthropologist across different cultures for thousands of years, right? Which is very different from those of us that since the 20th century have started to talk about the mind as a computer. And before that, you know, we all know there are works in philosophy about the metaphor being at some point thermodynamics and hydraulics, because that was the dominant sort of view of the time. And then during the time of Descartes being sort of this kinds of machines that have gears and mechanical machines in general. So mechanics, thermodynamics, sort of physics during a kind of a very prolific hippie area in the 70s especially, and then the computational turn. These are different turns for the explanations of mind and brain. And I agree that it's possible that focusing too much on the computational side as the only way to approach understanding of the mind might hinder other fields. I do want to hear what John has to say about this.
So, you know, actually, I think Carlos Perez on Twitter posted an article that my brother wrote about, you know, you know, I think he called it the 3M problem, you know, when you don't realize that you're slipping into metaphor. So I think you're absolutely right. I'll try and send it to you, Jonathan. I think he makes the point. But I think in that paper, and I agree with my brother on this point, that I do think that computation is a useful notion. And I don't think that we should confuse it with computers. You know, and Iris was also talking about this too. So I think that Marcin, when he spoke, said that if you believe that you need to process information and transform it, and we're clearly doing that, right? We something comes in, we do something with it, and something comes out. So in other words, I really do not have a problem with sensory motor transformations as computations or cognition, as Blake and I actually agreed, requiring a slightly more complex form of representation upon which you perform a computation. So I don't think computation is a metaphor. I think computers are. But I don't think computation as a notion is. And I think it's a very useful and I think irreplaceable idea in neuroscience. And I really don't know how we would do without it, to be honest. And I think where we'll disagree is on the representational side. In other words, how self-referential should representations be that you compute on. And you know, Blake and I disagree in so much that he feels that meaning is just a matter of relations between symbols that don't themselves have to refer to anything. Okay, but I don't think we would disagree that you can compute on these representations, but do they need to refer? So I don't know, but my view is either like my brother's, I just don't know how one would possibly do without the notion that the brain is information processing and computing on representations. I just don't know another way how to think about it.
Think about it like this. Imagine, indulge in this thought experiment that we are a completely different culture. And we do a lot of sort of navigation is our thing. Like we only care about navigation. And then we talk about the mind as mental navigation, or we talk about sort of the brain as the instrument of navigation or such, right? And then we would say, we can't imagine how else we can ever explain the brain other than in terms of navigation, because it's literally doing navigation. It's not just a metaphor. Look, this is what it does. So I think that's I want Jonathan to have a moment to respond back to us. We've been talking for a while.
So my question really comes sort of in Ida's vein, right? So if we used another metaphor, another model to talk about what our brains are doing, right? So I take the point that we can talk about what we're doing as information processing through, say, computation as a metaphor, but that I think commits us to certain presuppositions about how said composition, how said information processing goes on. And to use Ida's metaphor, if we thought about the brain as a gigantic sextant, right, as a navigation aid to coordinate the different parts of an embodied system, while we could still talk about that computationally, I think the kinds of research, the kinds of assumptions we make about intelligence, about cognition, about brains themselves would proceed in vastly different ways. So that's kind of the thrust of my question.
I know what you mean. I think, Sean asked is there a point where we have a particular lens through which we look that it begins to get in the way of progress? Probably. I'm sure we all have those kind of blind spots. But I think those are little metaphors that might get in the way. I think computation is a big one, and I don't think it's a metaphor. So I would say that one is too useful to just dismiss as a metaphor. But lower level things, I'm sure we're not aware sometimes when we're thinking metaphorically, but we think we're not. I think you're absolutely right. But I think this one's too meta to be disposed of in that way. That's how I think about it.
I also think we need to ring a bell every time that John and Blake agree on something, and right now we are really and I feel like I want to do something ceremonial in order to sort of mark this moment.
Oh, and let me just say, somebody was asking what I meant to Blake. I think that there's this idea that rule following or just correctly manipulating the relationship syntactically between objects is meaning, rather than in the way that I think Melanie means it, and I agree, that it actually refers to something. And that, of course, gets us into trouble because then you get the symbol grounding problem and things like that. But I think that there's a way of saying that if you just follow the rules and everyone agrees that the rules are being followed, then that alone is enough. And I think that's where the disagreement is. But I don't think there's disagreement about having varying degrees of complexity of representations upon which you perform computations.
Yeah. Am I unmuted? I don't know if I am. Yeah, okay.
You
So
are.
I'm actually agreeing with the vast majority of what John has said there. Computation.
Is that even allowed?
What's that? Is
that even
allowed?
allowed?
Yeah, apparently it's allowed. I don't think that computation is a metaphor. I would argue that the word computer is also not a metaphor, but that really depends on the definition that you're going to adopt for computer. But I think it's undeniable that if you look at what computation is actually defined as within computer science and how computer scientists tend to use the word computer, then the brain is literally a computer doing computation. It's not a metaphor. It matches the definitions as given and as used by the field of computer science. Now, you can ask whether that's useful or whether it impedes progress to focus on that. Because, similarly, like, we can view many different objects as being literally X or literally Y because they are, right? Like, technically, air is literally a liquid. Now, does that mean that I always want to think about air as a liquid when I'm modeling airflow? Not necessarily. It depends on the application. So I think it's possible that we maybe sometimes want to step away from the computational reality of the brain for certain purposes. But I think that the entire, like, a lot of progress has actually been made with this understanding that the brain is a computer. And I think it would be a shame to throw that away. And I think that as John said, there are some people who worry about the symbol grounding problem and the question of meaning. But if you're one of these people who doesn't think that's a problem like me, then to some extent, this is not an issue. You can say the brain is a computer and it doesn't raise any tricky philosophical questions.
So I'm less concerned about throwing away the metaphor of computation and more the ways that the exclusive focus of the brain as computer as a metaphor or computation narrows the ways in which we pursue our different kinds of inquiries, right? So it's fine to say within computer science, the brain is literally doing the kinds of computational exercises that the computer scientists are interested in. But insofar as we start thinking about the very real distinctions between, or the very real ways that the metaphor narrows how we approach the subject, I think we start running into problems like how do we compute ethics, or how do we compute art, emotion, so on and so forth, right? So my general concern here is not throwing away the metaphor, right? It's how the metaphor limits the various inquiries that we engage in, or forces a particular dominance of a particular kind of inquiry with regards to the kinds of fields that we're doing. So this is what I mean by limitations, not that it holds us back, but it narrows, in some senses, the scope of the inquiries we can perform.
I'm beginning to understand, Jonathan, better what you're asking. It's interesting that at Hopkins, for example, there's a neuroaesthetics group, right? And I'm actually quite down on it. In other words, and there's also, there's the neuroscience of business and the neuroscience of law and the neuroscience of art. And I actually feel that's highly problematic. So I don't think it's the computational metaphor that's at risk. It's the unbelievable greediness for seductive neuroscientific explanation. So I would say it's neuroscience that is going where it shouldn't be going. I don't think the computational theory of mind should be guilty. It's neuroscience that thinks it's going to come up with the fundamental explanation for every other area of human endeavor. That, to me, is much worse than metaphoric thinking. It's a kind of dictatorship of one area that thinks that it's going to come up with explanations for all the other ones. So if that's what you're getting at, you're 100% right. And in many areas of human endeavor, I think neuroscience should just shut up, frankly.
I'm shocked by how much I'm agreeing with John right now. I couldn't agree more with that last statement. The analogy I would give is, we don't want to explain everything with, low-level particle physics, because it's just not a useful reduction sometimes. That doesn't mean that everything doesn't reside on particle physics to some extent. And likewise, all of our behaviors, our ethics, art, whatever, do on some level depend upon the operations of our brain. But it's foolish for neuroscience to try to then overreach and say it's going to provide the explanations for all of these things, because it's just not a doable endeavor. And that's probably a far more dangerous thing and a more common failure mode in science than the computational idea of the brain somehow affecting our understanding of these things, I would argue.
Would it be concordantly, would it be foolish to say that computer science could ever compute some of the same things that you're talking about? Insofar as it,
I think on some level it must be the case that, say, our ethics are a result of computations. Like, I think that's just actually a non-question. It has to be the case. The evidence for the material nature of our mind is insurmountable, in my opinion, at this point. And once you accept that, it's a natural conclusion to assume that these things depend upon the computational properties of our brains. But that doesn't mean that explaining them is best done at that level of explanation.
Okay, better. I think that's important. That's very important, because it's one thing to say that our best bet at understanding the brain is computation. It's another thing to say the only level of explanation for the mind that is useful is the computation approach.
Exactly. Those are two different statements, and I agree with the first, not the second.
Exactly. So I think that Jonathan did a great job of bringing this up. No one had so far in none of our salons or in the other than philosophers discussed this before, that at the level of explanation of mind especially, this matters.
Right, because I mean, think about it. If that were the case, we would have to say that for every, great work of art, drama, movie, play, novel, which grabs us, explains the motives of human beings, that somehow it's completely deficient because the authors were not neuroscientists. I mean, can you imagine if we were to say that those were all deficient sketches of explanation, and we should go back and tell Jane Austen, go to grad school and don't write another novel? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, it's just the hubris of it, right? So yes, you're absolutely right.
I agree with everything you're saying. I would say that it's on the one hand, it's obvious that neuroscience doesn't explain all the stuff at this level. On the other hand, it's really compelling and easy to conflate these kinds of things. And this is a trap that I've certainly fallen into, and John has pointed out to me many times, and I'd say lots of other people, where we confuse, what is the right level of explanation. So I remember learning in graduate school that the single neuron is the right level of explanation for lots of stuff. And maybe they weren't saying it, but that's certainly what I learned from my courses. And that made me, for 5 years, think, well, I don't care about fMRI because they're not single level neuron explanations, and therefore they're not going to be adequate explanations. I have a different perspective now, which is that that I basically live under the tyranny of the neuron, and lots of neuroscientists do, where we all, for whatever reason, single neuron physiology explanations are the king or queen or whatever they are, and everything else plays a secondary role. And that's obviously wrong if you just think about it for a second, and yet rampant, I'd say, at least implicitly, in lots of what neuroscientists are doing.
And in a way, that's what's so nice, I think, about the computational theory of mind, is that it can be substrate independent in its formulation, which makes you not subject to the tyranny of neurons, right? It's really fascinating that in a way it liberates us a little bit from that. But I won't go on about that. Thank you, Jonathan. Blake, did you have anything else outrageous to say? Because I'm feeling a little disappointed here.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Fear not. You will come up again, and we will ostracize and otherwise debate you about many things. I'm sure.
Very good. Very good. I look forward to it. In the meantime, we can bask in this temporary reprieve and just go along with the loving.
Yeah, to make it, you guys, hopefully.
So Adrian is having a go. Can we invite Adrian in?
Yeah,
Adrian,
thanks, Blake.
Thank you, Blake. Hugs.
Adrian.
She's accepting.
Yes. That's
what I feel.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Yay.
Hi, Adrian.
Now I have to actually listen to what you're saying instead of reading all the interesting comments in the...
Adrian, do you want to introduce yourself for a second? Just because I don't know if John did an adequate job, and maybe not everybody here knows where you're coming from.
I'm Adrian Fairhall. I'm at the University of Washington. I am a computational neuroscientist, but I used to... I was a physicist, so that's the perspective that I'm coming from. And so I work on a lot of sensory coding questions, and only more recently, more cognitive ones. So a lot of, I think, where people are running aground is worrying about the words that we're using in cognition that were perfectly adequate in many ways for sensory systems. And so I think that's where some of the tension is coming from, is words that we were quite comfortable to use for more straightforward, simple things do not maybe translate so well into a cognitive domain. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's because I think we're going to have to come up with new ideas. Intentionality is one of them. One of the interesting things about thought is it's about things. It refers, right? In a way, it gets to, I saw in the chat people saying representation. In other words, the idea that there has to be some homomorphism between the world and the brain It has to be true, otherwise evolution would have done us in. Okay, but there's a spectrum. I think I said on Twitter the other day that if you take a plastic letter and press it into a piece of plasticine, you can say the plasticine represents the letter A, but it's a super passive thing, right? And then you can talk about the homunculus in motor cortex or in sensory cortex and say there's some homomorphism between the effector, the world, and the representation, but it's not a representation, an I representation. It's not being looked at independently of of it being triggered by the outside world. And all I think people in cognitive neuroscience worry about is you go from the plasticine letter to primary modality cortical areas that you mentioned to this other kind of representation, you know, like Ida works on, where you basically have a model that you can look at instead of the world at a delay. And that kind of extra is a challenge for us. And it is going to require, maybe not new vocabulary, but it's going to require new concepts that go beyond the way we think about sensory motor neuroscience. And
I completely agree, right? Because sensations and motor pieces are kind of this input and output ends of just a flow of dynamics from input to output. But there is a level at which we do form concepts that we're able to manipulate by thought. And I have no idea what that is in the brain. And I do think it's very distinct from the, you know, the dynamical responses that get triggered by sensory stimuli. We've done pretty well at kind of strobing that, right? And pulling off a firing rate and saying that is that at this moment in time. But that's a lie, right? Because everything is time dependent. You go back to the classic papers by Movshun and others, they completely throw out time, right? And it's all temporal, in fact. And so even the old-fashioned idea of a firing rate representing an input is kind of a fantasy.
Right.
But it doesn't make it not useful, right? It still
sure.
is
I mean,
the response that is triggered by a well-defined thing. So in some sense, in that sense, it is still a representation. It's just not, that representation concept is not one that will translate to the abstract level where we're trying to manipulate concepts.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Nick O'Shea wrote a wonderful book on the notion of representation in cognitive neuroscience, came out the year before last. You know, Nico Kriegerscourt has written about it. Piccinini has written about representation, and they all admit that the about type of representation, the representation that is looked at for content and reference that isn't sensory motor, is a real challenge, all right? And they write about it very beautifully. And I think that that needs to just be accepted for what it is. But, you know, neuroscientists aren't that familiar with these gradations of the notion of representation. The philosophers have been much more thoughtful about that, I think.
I think because we're not trying to do the kinds of experiments where that becomes relevant. You know, we've all kind of run for the parts of the problem that are solvable in some sense. So that's why there's so much activity, right, in sensation and motor. But we're not really setting ourselves problems in which you force the animals to form a representation. You watch how that representation is manipulated in a certain task. Even the more cognitive things that, you know, that we're trying to do with the buffalo and others, you know, the sort of Wisconsin card sorting task, you could still do that in a pretty banal temporal way that doesn't require really the formation of a manipulable concept.
Although Adrian, I think people like Stefano Fusi, maybe Tim Behrens, you know, Stefano's latest work on prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, where he's actually showing geometric abstractions in population space for context.
For context, right? But
yeah, so that's.
I still put that in the category of things that are slightly easier.
Yeah, no, right. In other words, yes, it's interesting. But would you think that context might be on the way to that aboutness? Do you think, or is it still more in your camp, the sensory motor?
Still somewhat more straightforward, right? Or at least. In those experiments, what is the representation exactly? What it says is that the dynamics of processing that information has settled on a rule that passes it through a certain geometric structure, right, in order to better discriminate. And so we've sort of taken the idea that the rule is represented and turned it into a rule, a dynamical rule. And so that doesn't seem like it to me is getting at our ability to sort of formulate an image, say, of a chess piece and move it around.
Right. I mean, everyone's asking, I agree with you entirely. Everyone's saying, what is the representation? I don't think it's difficult at all. Look, I'll show you. I have this is from a gay ski week in Colorado many years ago in Aspen. This is a representation of a duck. Okay, this is a pink little duck. All right, now it's not a real duck. And I can look at this and think about ducks without a real duck anywhere. I can close my eyes and imagine a pink duck. And in fact, like a voodoo doll, you could put needles into this duck and there could be another duck somewhere that would feel incredible pain. So representation is a stand-in. It's a substitute for the real thing that you can operate on without having to have the real thing anywhere in sight. It's not that complicated.
Well, okay. I mean, fair. But I mean, yes, that's what we mean when we talk about representations in cognition. But I don't think that means we're not allowed to use the word representation for the other things, right? When you show a stimulus, it builds a representation in visual cortex. I mean, I think that's a fair terminology.
And this is an orange moose from Sweden, right? Which is also an abstraction, right?
How many random little plastic animals do you have right there?
So what I'm saying is actually, you know, it's interesting, Adrian.
You don't want to get into a little tiny thing battle here.
I would say that
John has.
I think we would be better off if we reserved the term representation for aboutness, and we used another term for the direct homomorphism when the stimulus is still present.
Yeah, I think this comes back to things that were going on in the chat. You know, people maybe with a more philosophical training are more rigorous about word use and are therefore more bothered when people use it in ways that don't align with a very well-defined, within a definition. And I think you're right that neuroscience as a field is sloppy with language. And that has had a lot of advantage for us because it has given us metaphorical tools to work with, right? The idea of neural coding is, I mean, it's dubious, but it's not wrong. It's a roadway, you know, it's a
crutch,
stop,
a kind of crutch
to maybe a deeper understanding, but it was a useful one. It helped us.
Just to make sure we don't like anger the gods of the matrix by being too much of in agreement. I don't think it's just semantics. And I don't think it's just fortunate misunderstanding that led to progress. I think it's mistakes that have led to, on one level, on a financial level, to defunding of entire humanities departments. It has led to challenges for funding of human research. It has led to very false assumptions that neurons can solve everything. I mean, we know what happened to, like, you know, blue brain projects, and like, you know, there's a lot of situations where we know that there were certain claims that 10 years ago everyone thought this is the way to solve everything, and we know it's not. Currently, we have Elon Musk who's making similar claims, also a little bit like a decade too late to talk about certain things, but claiming it's new. We've been here before. We've been in the situation where it's not just about mistaking semantics because philosophers are too picky or too sensitive about words. It's actually, you know, there is a fantastic book in rhetorics called How to Do Things with Words. And things happen when we use certain words in certain ways. It's not just a matter of semantics. Entire section.
I just want to understand what it is that you're pointing your finger at. So on one hand, we maybe have some conceptual or some methodological even sloppiness because we use the same word for many different things that aren't really the same thing. I think the defunding issue is more about the claim that we can learn about that by looking at single neurons or at the activity patterns of neurons. And that's a different thing, right? I mean, the complaint about the conceptualization of representation to me is on a very different level of complaint than, you know, the sorts of complaints that John has as well of, you know, what are we going to learn by just looking at the, you know, at the activity of millions of neurons at the same time if we don't have a better language and a better formulation to understand what's going on. I'm not sure that it's the misdefinition of representation that's standing in the way between interpreting activity patterns of millions of neurons and a better neuroscience that is more maybe holistic, that has a better language for thinking about what cognition means. So, I just wanted to surface that I think your objection really is more about that program of that meaning will just emerge from the recording of millions of neurons, rather than this particular issue about using the words, say, computation and representation sloppily.
So so there's different levels of this sort of bigger issue, right? I guess that's why I was trying to sort of have the different crises, and you and others were totally right that there are different sessions that we had would fall under a lot of them. I think that there is what would it take if we have confused explanation and evidence when it comes to neurons? What does it entail? What are the different things that happen then? First of all, we're not going to get explanation. We're not going to reach the understanding that we want, because we have the entire connectome of the fly and it's not solved. What it does, it can't solve everything that this fly does, right? So for instance, having that entire knowledge, even if we had it, it's not going to solve all the levels of explanation problems that we need. And we are smart enough to be able to see it now. We don't need to first get there and then realize, oh, but we didn't solve the problems. The second thing that it does is that instead of looking or developing tools or looking at the right level of analysis or finding new ways to actually analyze this or study this, we're going to hold the same court for like a couple of decades of just trying to at some point get neurons to give rise to meaning, right? And so the example that I gave, I think in one of the last ones, is this church in Germany that was playing this piece. And this piece, it's going to run for 600 years. And one of the chords was being changed after 2 decades or something. And I feel like we should make sure we can avoid that. If we think about these things, we can avoid holding some chord for 2 decades without anything changing and not having progress in neuroscience. And like, there's so many resources we're using if we do that. So I fully agree with you. So I think that what I tried to disagree, and we ended up agreeing again, which is that it's not just about the semantics. It's not just about using the wrong words. It's actually about entire programs of research, entire approaches to neuroscience being counterproductive and blocking.
Don't make that my argument. I'm quoting
No,
German.
but I just think, just to say, in a way, Adrian, I think what Ida is also saying is, on the one hand, you're saying, yes, we're going to need something else to get to this cognitive variant of representation, and it's not going to yield to the sensory motor approaches. And yet, I think Ida's right that the whole neuroscience enterprise behaves as though you will, if you keep on plugging with the ways that you did sensory motor neuroscience, you'll get cognitive neuroscience. So in other words, it is true that one on the one hand can say that there is, beyond just a semantic difference, a qualitative distinction, but let's keep on plugging at the sensory motor way, what I call the Sherringtonian way of doing neuroscience, and we'll get the answer. And I think that was my sort of complaint to both Tony and to Paul, is that they, particularly Paul, think that a sensory motor treatment will get there, whether you look at evolutionary anatomy and so I think you're being, if I may say, a tiny bit disingenuous.
I feel like I have to roughly agree, right? If there is the concept, if there is an abstract representation of something that we can manipulate, I do believe it is present in the brain, in the firing of neurons somehow, maybe in a very different way or a way we haven't thought about before, but I don't think that we will not learn by recording many neurons at the same time, while people are manipulating things. We're just not doing those experiments yet.
Yeah.
I'll just say that
we have learned a huge amount in the last 5 years from being able to record thousands of neurons simultaneously. I mean, all this amazing work, right, by Anne Chatelain and by Nick Steinmetz, where you see that what we used to spend so much time trying to characterize, right, as noise is actually not noise. It's part of large-scale patterns that are happening all over the brain. So we have to figure out what they mean. They're not meaningless at all, right?
Wait. Nobody claims that people who are using NeuroPixel, their work is meaningless. No one ever in this, ever, not even close, not even slightly close. So let's not make that, let's not bring that kind of, let's not invite that straw man in at all. It's not invited, not welcome. But let's look at the sort of things that we are saying is counterproductive. I am personally claiming, strongly standing by it, it's counterproductive to say just recording from 1 million neurons equates understanding human cognition. Okay, so I think on that we agree. Okay, and I go further than that, and I say that it's counterproductive to make these arguments when, especially, you know, it would create a particular culture which would block other ways that would actually get at the question of cognition, for instance. It's very okay to do that. Just let's not. So if for instance, if you look at Paul's wonderful paper, and at some point I hope Paul will be.
Paul's been getting a lot of abuse from me, so he has every right to come in and give me a slap.
Yeah. But one thing that I loved about Paul's paper is how elegant the first part of the paper was. And something that I was disappointed by is that when it reaches the point of actually talking about the things in cognition that now needs to be redefined, that doesn't happen. And the terms that actually are used are still the terms that have been used in psychology, right? So I think that is a place where it's great in a sense at some point. I'm hearing the echo from Paul again. Everybody else here? Okay, perfect, thanks. So it's great to appreciate phylogenetic work, neural work, neuropixel work, millions of neurons together work, and all of that. But the part that we are saying has an issue is when that work is claiming to take over everything else and losing everything else at the cost of, also without providing explanations, just stopping there. Here, look at all of these, look, millions of neurons, look how beautiful. Here, stop, no reasoning, therefore we can address cognition better, right? That is the part where we are kind of challenged by. John is not here, should I call him? Are you?
John, I think he just turned his video off.
He never does that, I think.
Did I?
Oh, hey, you are here.
It was waiting to reconnect.
It's very blurry.
I think his Wi-Fi again went out, so I can call him.
But before Paul rebuts, I would just say that it's so nice to have Adrian here. I feel like everything Adrian says, I want to agree with. Where in contrast, anything John says, I feel the need to disagree with. Even when you both agree with each other, somehow I feel like I want to disagree with whatever he's saying and agree with you. So.
I do understand you completely.
So while we're waiting,
can you invite John back in? He just said to invite.
I will invite John back in. And Paul is reconnecting too. I will say, I had a very different take on Paul's work and his presentation, and so I'll just try to summarize what I think. And I'd love to hear what Paul thinks about what I think. So my perspective was the following: that we are all operating within a taxonomy of cognitive phenomena, and that taxonomy evolved at least partially, whether to 80% or 20%, through a kind of grassroots collective phenomenology. And that's a fine way for things to evolve in science. But one could imagine having a principled methodological way of establishing constraints or guidelines for learning or inferring a taxonomy of cognitive phenomenon. And that it seems like a laudable goal. It's not obviously a plausible goal, but it's a laudable goal. And then Paul proposed that A, we should do that, and B, a way of doing it, which I think John says.
But like I just said, he never got to cognition. He didn't get to cognition.
I know, he didn't say he was, I don't think he was answering the question. He was proposing a framework that one could use to get to that answer. And there's the two different things are, should we have a principled methodology to learn a taxonomy of cognitive phenomena that would, for example, give us new concepts that we don't have yet?
But cognitive neuroscience are methodological. I mean, it's just insulting to all the other areas of science to say that they need to be looking at the Cambrian explosion to understand cognition. It just doesn't. But I just wanted to say something to what Adrian said before Paul comes on and gets furious. I think where we agree is that it will always be useful to gather neural data. Okay, I guess what I'm trying to say, and I'd be interested to see what you have to say about this, is that neural data at some point becomes something to look at, just like behavior is something to look at. But I don't think neural data to look at, the way we look at behavior to think about what's going on, is quite the same as having the neurons be the explanation for the phenomenon. In other words, you don't say behavior is the explanation for behavior. So what I'm saying is at a certain point, we're going to look at neural data and use it in a different way. Do you see what I'm saying? Where it's going to be more like behavior than the explanation for behavior. Right? That's what I'm saying. Is we have to find new ways.
No, I completely agree with that. And I don't think anyone would claim that just gathering the data is the end of the problem, right? It's trying to understand what's going on in that data, but we can't understand what's going on in the data.
I'm not making the point about just gathering the data. I'm saying that there are qualitatively different uses that neural data can be used for. And I'm saying that when you look at a neuron in a stretch reflex versus looking at a neuron the way Stefano does, the way that you're using it in your explanation is different.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that if we
that's
agree to
another
that,
area where we really have advanced in the last few years, right? Thanks to having that data.
Right. So in other words, the use to which you put the neuron and the circuit, the explanatory work that it does, depends on what you're asking, even though it will always play some role. But the role it will play will be qualitatively different across phenomena.
And
that's,
I'm
I think,
confident we have not completed that task of finding how to figure out what's going on from the data. I am sure there are other ways of looking at it that go beyond even the best work people are doing now that are going to be needed to address the kinds of questions that you've posed.
Yeah.
And I'd say, John, it's not just neural data, it's brain data. There's glia, all sorts of other stuff. And that probably matters too.
Yeah, right. I mean, I wish I could come up with an analogy about how the same object can play a different role in the question.
Can you use your little plastic duck?
No, my duck isn't going to do the job now. But in the meantime, while I'm trying to think of a clever analogy about what I'm trying to say here, maybe we can have poor Paul defend himself.
Well, I would just like to.
He gets to defend himself.
I would just like to describe my viewpoint rather than have John do it for me, because I don't think you did it fairly. I mean, again, you're doing the my way or highway approach, which is what
I'm not.
Yes,
I just disagree with you.
If I am, well, no, but it's a little.
Don't make this like a presidential debate, John.
Yes, I am speaking now, Dr. Krakauer.
John,
anyway,
please speak for yourself.
Sorry, I was just trying to be Kamala Harris there. I am not suggesting a tyranny of the neuron, not at all. And I don't, think that we can just. I'm not sure why you call it deflationary to say that we need another source of information on top of all the other sources of information that we all agree we want: behavioral data, neural data, recording it at the level of MRI, at the level of single neuron studies. I'm just saying, hey, here's this other data set, and it actually tells us something. It tells us numerous things. It limits the possible search space of computational level algorithms that the brain might be implementing. It limits the kinds of sort of theories about the brain that are worth exploring because some are better compatible than others. And so it's a little bit like, I think Josh was saying it just as I was having essentially a Wi-Fi problem, so I didn't quite catch it. But Josh was saying that, and we had this small exchange over email, that there's another source of information, and it might tell us something.
Yeah, but
But
might.
also, I would like to also respond to the question of meaning, because I think you portrayed my view as saying, "Oh, there's no problem with meaning; we can just do away with it." That problem is actually the thing that's been driving my own research since I was a grad student. I think it's the biggest problem we have. And when I say we, I mean AI people, neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists. Everybody is facing that problem. In part, I think, because our models need, leave a lot to be desired. Our methods are not maybe fully integrated across different levels, and there's many aspects of it, and there's no one big answer that I would propose. But I do think there's some useful insights that come from considering the fundamental problems that living things, mobile animals encounter in their life. And this is where this control aspect comes in, because certainly in those cases, the meaning is relatively trivial, but that doesn't mean, that we'll get meaning that magically we'll understand the meaning of words and the meaning of creative acts that humans perform. And, I'm proposing a perspective that I think is very well grounded by an additional piece of data. And, it doesn't explain human cognition, but, what can I say except, well, we're not there yet, but I don't think 70 years of classical cognitive science is there yet either. And by the way, incidentally, I was recently part of a seminar. I was invited by Michael Anderson, who's a philosopher who thinks about these things from the other end, from the very much human data. I don't know how many people are familiar with his work. He wrote a nice book recently called After Phrenology. In fact.
Yeah, I've read it. I've read it.
Anyway, so
his points. It's a very confused book.
Well, I'm sure you don't agree with what he's saying. But the point is that there is a large number of people in psychology that believe that we need to sort of, reflect upon some of the questions that are being asked and think about whether we're asking the right ones. And I was happy to see that there's actually a lot of people asking these questions. I was not aware of it until I met him. I was not aware that these things are being discussed throughout psychology as well. It's this problem, and I do think eventually it does come down. It does connect with this problem of meaning.
I mean, just so people understand, Michael Anderson is not he's not attacking psychology, right? His book is more a big concern with modularity and decomposition.
Yeah.
Now that is so to formulate that as anti-psychology is completely wrong, right? It's just that what he's concerned about is if you are going to believe in psychological constructs, then how do you map them onto the brain? And he's against the sort of Bechtellian modularity and decomposition, and he's much more a fan of the sort of Russ Poldrack sort of approach to neural imaging. Now, that's a very interesting debate. Maybe we should have Michael on, but to me, or Russ for that matter, but that to sort of dovetail that set of concerns which he has, which are very interesting, with your saying that psychologists are full of outdated notions and they need to be reconstructed through some sort of evolutionary constraint argument is the one that I just don't agree with. I love the evolutionary argument, and as a sensory motor person, I think it's brilliant, but I just don't think that it's the way to have a diss at cognitive psychology.
Well, the diss has been going on for a long time. I mean, as you know, the cognitive psychology has had its critics for, longer than it's been called cognitive psychology. Those ideas, this debate has been going on since, James and Dewey and the structuralists and probably well before that. And what I think is that there is a convergence of dissatisfactions going on these days, where people are more and more willing to ask, not to throw it all out, but rather to ask, well, which assumptions do we really want to hold on to, and which ones don't we want to hold on to? You know, the sort of good old-fashioned AI assumptions are being abandoned in the last 20 years or so. Which other ones should be abandoned? The idea of coding and decoding, you know, that's becoming more, and it's becoming possible now to at least criticize it, which was not possible 20, 30 years ago. So there's a question of, do we have to buy into all the assumptions or not? And then if so, which ones do we want to hold on to? And that's the same exact question that I'm asking. I think certain of those concepts, you know, if you apply this additional set of constraints, certain concepts survive just fine, others not so well. And so it may be a useful way to narrow the search space.
Well, when your evolutionary project gets rid of some of the terms in William James's book, I'd like to see it. But I also think
read our attention.
Well, yeah, but even there, I mean, I'm not going to get into a discussion about attention. All I'm saying is that I think one has to distinguish between psychology and behaviorally based task constructs and attempts to map them onto the brain. Michael Anderson is concerned about how those map onto the brain. If you're concerned about that, that is not an attack on psychology. It's an attack on how we meld psychology with neural structures. Okay, so in other words, you keep changing. Yes, but psychologists are not guilty of the problems inherent to doing that. That is a problem for all of us. And all I'm saying is the sensory motor approach is no more likely to succeed than having psychologists try and map their experiments onto structures. That's what I'm saying.
Well, unless it maps better.
Well, I haven't seen a shred of evidence for it.
Well, all right, that's a whole other discussion I don't want to monopolize, so I'll
Thanks for joining us, Paul. Despite the animosity, unrelenting animosity.
It's just that I think evolution is. I think if Paul is known for bringing evolution back into neuroscience, it will be the biggest educational advance that we've had in a field which forgotten about evolution. I'm a huge fan of it.
Look, Leah Krubitzer was there before me. John Kaz was there before me. You know, so I'm not gonna be the one to do that. All right, so.
Oh, I think you underestimate what you did there.
Cool. That was a positive note to end the conversation on.
Just don't think it needs to be joined with an attack on psychology. That's all I'm saying.
You can end on a positive note.
I think that's Paul. I mean, on that
No, we can't. I must disagree.
For everyone who doesn't know this, so Paul and the Salon sort of hosts, we've had like email chains, and it has gone on, and John has been ranting and Paul has been replying. It's been like a very wonderful process.
John and I've been arguing since like the mid-90s, so this is small.
Exactly. We've been arguing. So basically, I think that it's great that this sort of back and forth happens. And I hope, Paul, that we can see at some point specific, maybe more precise and a little bit potentially more realistic version of how to incorporate phylogenetic understanding or lineage into our understanding of cognition. Because I know that there are my colleagues working with reinforcement learning, people at Microsoft Research. I know people in neuroscience, in cognitive science that would really appreciate a way that this could benefit all of us. For instance, if we want to understand particular thing, it doesn't address everything, obviously. We can't recapture everything in phylogenetic terms. It's not useful to capture everything. But I do look forward to maybe your next bigger review paper, like, you know, or something like that, or your book maybe, where there is a specific section on very precise examples of some approaches in cognition or in AGI that could really benefit from phylogenetic.
Well, check out our attention paper. So this is a paper that was stimulated after I presented this stuff, and it was essentially a discussion over beer in a pub in Amsterdam with a number of people who study attention, who have also been, and my talk wasn't, by the way, about attention. It was essentially the talk you saw. And they said, well, and we just got into a discussion. And the result of that discussion was a paper with 6 senior authors, essentially, in which we sort of went through a couple of the problems with the concept of attention that have been pointed out really for 100 years. And we went through some of the difficulties in interpreting, for example, the parietal cortex as a part of an attentional network. And in the article, we go through these approaches, and then we take what Bernard Hammel calls the synthetic approach, where it's a little bit like computational modeling, where you come up with theories on how you would design a system. But we marry it with the phylogenetic story, specifically focusing on the orientation systems and what happens in primates given their strong visual acuity. And we essentially come up with a different way of interpreting parietal cortex, which is very, very much closer to sensory motor control, very much based on some of the ideas of Graziano, Krubitzer-Kaz, and Stepniewska, and other people looking at action maps, and essentially propose an alternative explanation for some phenomena of attention, not all attention, because again, the position is that it's not one thing that must have a single network with one explanation for all the phenomena. In fact, what it is that we have this umbrella term that we have defined not quite properly, and within that term we lump all these phenomena. But these phenomena can actually be explained from another perspective, and they match up to the neural data, I think, quite well. Now that's a fairly broad and sort of speculative review, but it does cite the relevant data. So that would be an example, again, a starting point, but an example of a more concrete, specific thing.
I do appreciate it. And I think it's a specific example that doesn't address cognition, but the function of parietal cortex as it pertains to attention. It's a little bit more focused on a brain region. So it's not quite at the level of cognition in general. And I agree with you. And I linked the paper for people who want to take a look at it. It's
okay.
called One Knows What Attention Is, with a wonderful list of co-authors. Brad says, is that a straw man though, Paul? I wonder how many attention researchers...
Yeah, we discussed that in there as well. We cite a number of people that have made this same kind of criticism before. We're essentially echoing a dissatisfaction with this terminology that's been around for quite a while, and we're proposing one sort of avenue for sort of getting out of that and to something maybe that's a little bit more well defined and
because in a way, Paul, you know the word movement and the word sensory are also blanket terms for loads of things. So you could do it to everything.
Sure. Yeah. Well, anyway, we do it to attention. Read the paper and see what you think.
No, I actually have, and I think it's fantastic. I don't disagree. I just think that, as you said, 100 years people have been worried. So in other words, presumably it was some old-fashioned cognitive neuroscientist psychologist who also were concerned about it, right? So in other words, everyone can be concerned.
And yet, I think that looking at the data from neuroscience as well as from evolution helps to channel that lingering dissatisfaction into something that's a testable set of hypotheses. And I think that's a good thing. And if we could do that with, consciousness and other difficult concept, it would be great. But I haven't.
Creative role of ambiguity, right? I do think that there is a point to that we gain from ambiguity because it allows the mixture of metaphors that can eventually lead us to the right path.
Yeah.
I do think there is something to say about grounding certain cognitive functions in some phylogenetic lineage. And that's something that's very different between us and microprocessors, as these things sort of emerge in a different way as opposed to in a modular and designed way. So I do think that there is a lot of value to what you're describing, to also maybe being more precise about functional separation on the basis of the phylogenetic lineage. I think that's a very valuable approach. Something that I hope that we're doing now, and I hope that we get to do it properly, is different notions of reward, how they would emerge from, or even memory or caching food and everything. They all kind of can fall out gradually in a reinforcement learning that goes long enough if you start with the idea of homeostasis. So, initially, you just need to make sure that, and then the concept of hunger, the times that we get hungry, we're not going to die. We feel it in intervals that are useful for some kind of maintenance. So the hunger itself, it's kind of a epiphenomenal thing that gradually over the evolution we have learned, so that it has emerged. So, or pain, like when I hit my nail or my toe to the door, I'm not going to die. Well, why does it hurt so much? It will help me to avoid certain kinds of obstacles in the future that is going to be helpful in the long run. So there is.
Yeah, I'd like to. So, sorry, I would mention perceptual control theory, which I think is a nice perspective on many of the things you're saying. I don't know if you're familiar with this view.
I am. I don't think it's quite getting at what I was describing in the sense of the particular notions. So pain or hunger, these are different from perceptual control, right? Their signal.
Well, no, but perceptual control theory would provide a context for those things.
Context, yes, but I'm more interested in the internal development of these different things. So what happened that internally we started to, all of us have the internal state of hunger and pain, and then it stayed throughout a lot of different evolutionary stages, right? I think that looking at that kind of thing in whatever domain, you did attention, I want to look at some kind of rewards maybe, or some caching or planning or memory that would come out of this long-term maintenance of my existence together with a short-term homeostasis combined together leads to a couple of different things that can emerge out of it. And I think computationally, there is a nice way to get there by looking at it. You're getting a book out.
This is a good book. This is a really good book. Steve Wise and Dick.
Oh yeah, prefrontal cortex is where I live.
Yeah,
That's the hometown.
I know, John.
But you keep, it's a wonderful book, but I just don't think that it makes your case. I mean, it's a beautiful evolutionary argument.
No, I'm not saying it makes your case. I'm saying it makes it addresses.
I just want to say one thing to Ida. Whenever I stub my toe, I tell myself, I know this is going to happen again. In other words, you just know.
Lost.
But it's such a great face to have lost him on.
He doesn't realize. Okay, I'm gonna
kick him out.
Aaron, what about Aaron?
Yeah, Aaron, please save us.
I'm gonna call John and tell him what's going on.
All right. I guess my question is a little bit more high level. So we've been talking a lot about, building models and intermediary representations and how that helps us to achieve understanding. But my question is, what really is understanding? How do we know when we've achieved it? What's the point at which we can say, I've answered this question, we can now move on to something else because I fully understood it? And I really struggle with that. I'm not sure how to answer that. And I feel like that really is the context we need to be able to frame a lot of these other discussions.
I think it's a really important question that we should all think hard about. For me, anytime I write down the word understanding, I then try to remember to cross it out because it's so poorly defined. And people often pretend like it's a binary thing. Like now we have understanding, but like a minute ago we didn't. But who's to say that there's phase transitions in understanding? Maybe it's a smooth continuum and we're just continually building more and more understanding. So that's not an answer to you, because there's still the question of like how much understanding is required before we're satisfied. To me, that seems like a very subjective, personal thing. Like the understanding I have of how my computer works, I'm satisfied with it. I have no idea about lots of the guts, and it's a level of understanding that makes me happy. I can use it the way I want. When it breaks, I can fix it the way I want. And so I think it's a very personal threshold that is okay.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking back to the first session when there's a lot of criticism about going too far horizontally. You can spend all this time really dissecting a problem or getting really invested in like how a particular paradigm actually works. And I guess like we as a field need to sort of have a threshold at which we say, this is enough, we should move on.
Maybe Adrian can comment, because your article and a lot of what you were saying was really about like this low dimensional constructs and whether they give us understanding or not, in a sense.
Yeah, I guess the difficulty with your question really is that biology has the property that there is always a deeper level and another level to go to. And so I feel like I think one of the downsides of being a physicist is that you have a pretty high bar for what you mean by understanding something. You really think that you should be able to write down the equation, simulate it, predict it, predict new phenomenology. So that's the level of understanding I would like to get to. And I would like to be able to explain to you the structure of those equations and what are the interactions, what are the key terms, right, in those equations. That is great. And if we could get to that point with systems, I would feel like that accounts for my level of understanding. But then if I were a molecular biologist, I would say, but you have completely ignored, 97% of the reality of this situation, which is there are all these underlying, phenomenology that you didn't even bother with, right? So I think it's, sort of totals all the way down. We have to sort of choose a level of understanding, choose the structure of understanding that works for you at that level, or works for the field at that level. But be very aware that there are higher levels, that maybe John would like us to understand at, and there are lower levels at which my colleagues in the physiology department would like us to understand it. But how did that really, how did that synaptic plasticity rule really get implemented, and what may affect it, in terms of molecular mechanisms? And none of us are going to be able to work at all those levels. I think we have to choose one and find the level of formulation that is appropriate for that level, and then hope we can all talk to one another and gain from the understanding that is generated at those different levels. It is really, I think, a new situation that so many people from so many different fields are working in biology, right? Which something that I hated when I was a student. I ran away from biology classes, but coming back to it, I now remember why I hated it so much. But it does open all these very interesting doors, right? And it will require us to be respectful of knowledge that is not really in our own domain, and see what we can take from it. John,
Aaron, I would just say I just posted something in the chat, a very interesting paper by Kaplan and Craver on where they basically try and sort of revise a position they took earlier on mechanistic arguments, where they basically admit that more details are not better. Okay, in other words, understanding actually, and it's a longer conversation, requires by definition omission of details. Okay, so the question is, and I think this is what Adrian's getting at, is how does one, in a principled way, construct explanations with the right level of omission of detail and idealization? All right. Now, in this paper and others, which maybe we could have a session on this, there are more principled ways to discuss how one omits and idealizes so that one can construct workable explanations. I think what's happened is a counter pressure to that obviousness, in my view, is that tool fanaticism has been so good at generating more details that it's become almost a self-aggrandizing requirement on the part of the tool lists to think that more details are in fact better, when we know actually that understanding requires idealization and omission. So I think that's the pressure. When the tools give you details, but details don't give you more understanding, what on earth do you do, right? And I think that this is where sort of a philosophy kind of training can help a little bit to at least navigate that distinction. So I think your question is a very good one, and there are probably principal ways to go after it. But in the current deluge of techniques, it's extremely difficult to actually make the omission case. I mean, that's my view.
So are you suggesting then that, I mean, or maybe Adrian is suggesting that there really is no sort of proper level that we can all agree upon, and some set of representations that we should be sort of working towards or working on that will help us achieve some sense of understanding? Like it's sort of subjective.
It's not subjective, I may just say, that what the philosophers call it is the contrastive causality, right? I think I used this explanation the first time you were here, that there are at least 5 explanations for why Socrates died, right? He was condemned by the government and he stopped breathing, and everything in between. They're all equally valid explanations for the death of Socrates. And so you simply need to say, what's the causal contrast that you care about? If you want to know why was he condemned to death, then it doesn't really matter if he took hemlock or had his head chopped off, right? So I think one way forward would be to be pluralistic and know that any question has its different levels of causal contrast, and then pick. But what you mustn't do is ask your question at causal contrast level 2 and then think that your explanation at level 5 is going to cut it. That's where I get upset, is where people switch lanes with respect to the type of answer they give to the other causal contrast question.
I think that's a really good point, John. Sorry, Aaron, just to follow up on that. Another thing that people commonly do, and I'm certainly guilty of this, is saying we have this one kind of causal contrast and therefore we don't need the other ones because this one explains it. And that's also not true. They all explain it. They explain it differently, and that's okay. Sorry. Yeah.
So then it sounds like if you're interested in an explanation on a particular level, that there's
Aaron, in case you don't know, we can't hear you.
Conrad,
no.
Conrad, oh my God, it pains me to see a former postdoc suffer this way.
Oh.
Anyone else want to comment while Aaron struggles? Are you back, Aaron?
Yeah, I'm back, sorry.
Okay, so you're going to have to go through what we just saw in gesture.
I was pantomiming my question. You didn't understand it?
Oh.
No, I guess I was asking, so if we're hoping to seek an understanding at a particular level, that it's not really useful then to try to seek an explanation at another level. And so it sounds like it isn't, I guess it's sort of a useless endeavor to try to hop back and forth across these levels if you really want to understand something at one particular level.
Right. I suspect that most of the time, you know, the way I see it, there are 3 projects in science. There's the attempt to explain one level down. There's the work within the level, and then there's the spanning all the level kind of science, right? The sort of universal theory of everything. And I feel like they're different endeavors, frankly. I just think they're different. I think they're all interesting, but I don't think that the vertical spanning explanation will substitute for a good horizontal or one level down kind of explanation. And there was a question from Melanie about what's an example of a causal contrast in neuroscience. If you said that Fred had a reactive depression because his dog died, and he's sad because he feels a sense of loss for his dog, that's an explanation. If you said he is crying because his tear ducts are beginning to open, or you said that he's crying because there's a change in the balance of dopamine and serotonin, you wouldn't substitute the fact that he was crying and feeling depressed because he lost his dog with some kind of serotonin dopamine story, right? They both might be true, but you'd never substitute one for the other. They'd both be true. That would be a causal contrast. So a psychotherapist saying, I'm going to try and help you through the loss of your dog is no less useful than somebody that gives you an SSRI for 6 months because you're feeling the sense of loss for the dog. They're both equally valid explanations for the sadness.
Melanie, can you tell us your thoughts? Because you were chatting up a storm.
Oh, wow. I'm very confused by this whole discussion, I have to admit. I think, the whole last part of the discussion got confusing because I wasn't sure if we were talking about us understanding something about the brain or the mind, or if we were talking about understanding how the brain understands. And I wasn't sure what Aaron was. Am I right, Aaron? Is that your name? Sorry, that which question you were asking.
I guess what I was really asking was like, how do we know when we've achieved understanding of how the brain works?
Yeah, I'm the wrong person to be up here for that. I have no idea. But I think Adrian was right. There's no kind of end to a question in science. That the explanations that we give are in terms we have this terminology that is further refined. I think of like Newton's laws, right? He had this notion, and it was a huge jump in scientific progress where he said, okay, instead of just having all this descriptive stuff like Kepler had, we're going to have some laws, dynamical laws, which have causality. That is, we have force. But then the question is like, what's force? And people criticized him for having this concept of force and called it, spooky action at a distance. It had no mechanical underpinning. And then later, when people started understanding like nuclear physics, then there became some refinement of the idea of what force is. But we still have these terms that we don't really understand, like gravity. What is that mechanistically? People are still arguing about that. So I think this just goes on and on and on. And Adrian said it's turtles all the way down. I think that's kind of what she meant.
Right. So how useful are those intermediary representations if we just have to then figure out what they actually mean in terms?
So one thing that I want to add to the earlier question. can I think it? Okay, it's good. So one thing that I wanted to add. I think it's Sean's camera. Could you kindly? Sorry, not camera, microphone. Somebody's giving an echo. If ever, yeah. If you mute, that helps. Oh, is it working now? Oh, it's good. So one thing that I wanted to say to Aaron is there were different people in philosophy of science thinking about exactly the question that you raised, which is a great question. When do we know that we have understood something? When is it? So some folks thought, so Descartes had this idea that it's like destroying a building and rebuilding it anew every time you had to update last theories. Otto Neurath, many years later, suggested the idea or the sort of a comparison to this ship that is in a storm and you're rebuilding it. And then that sort of analogy turned into a raft in other philosophers, etc., including Ernest Sosa. The thing that is common in these, and then you obviously you had the falsification ideas that came from Popper that are the most well-known, I guess, among scientists, that you just can falsify things. And at some point, the idea there is that even if you reach the ultimate answer, which according to some is 42, you're still not going to know. You're still not going to know that you've gotten there. So there is these different ideas, and one idea is that basically it's the ship that we are rebuilding constantly while in a storm because we are using it, etc. There is a lot of arguments from successive science. So if you build a bridge and the bridge holds up successfully and you can cross over a river, does that mean you understand a lot of things? So some argument is that you don't need understanding to build something. So the kind of Feynman ideas of, oh, I will only understand things if I can build it. A lot of people have argued, no, actually, you can build something without understanding what's going on, which is probably what will happen in many cases in AI, where we would manage to achieve certain kind of level of performance without understanding. And I think Melanie does a great job of describing this in a lot of her examples. So I think that your question is very deep, but the answer to it, it depends from which philosopher of science, which discipline you would ask. And I think the answer is we're never going to get to a full understanding of anything. The best we can hope for is that the ship that we are rebuilding is in some notion better than the ship we had before. And that betterness is not based on the success of science in building something. It could be something like Jonathan Flowers was saying, and perhaps we need to understand the mind from a lot of different kinds of metaphors in order to progress our understanding of the mind while maintaining the idea of computation for brains and neurons, right? And so I think one of the things that John talks about, this vertical levels, or Melanie talks about in terms of crisis of meaning, or a lot of other people talk about, including even perspectives like what Paul brings in, where he says, hey, let's capture it from this other perspective. I think all of these, and that's part of our hope here, are profoundly valuable in realizing understanding has these different sort of dimensions. And I think your question beautifully brought it out in everyone. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Ida. That was really
To
helpful.
Melanie, Melanie, I don't think it's that there are a lot of very interesting philosophers working on the issue of understanding in science. Okay, now scientists, again, feel like they don't need to go and consult such a literature because they know it themselves, and that's wrong. But there are very thoughtful pieces on what understanding is, right? In other words, you have a phenomenon, you have a theory that is intelligible, that you can use to construct explanations that are understandable. And what does one mean by intelligible? Well, what it means by intelligible is that through practice, you develop workable intuitions with which to use that theory to construct explanations of the phenomenon P. So there are ways to think about it. Now you take those notions that philosophers and others have built about understanding, and you combine those with the notion of causal contrast, and it begins to be less problematic, right? In other words, it's not so terrible. I think, Aaron asked the right question, which is if you have a notion of understanding, and there are clear ones, there are disagreements, obviously, and you have your causal contrast, then in a way we can actually stop veering into each other's lanes and jumping too far vertically. I don't think it's actually that complicated, quite honestly. What's complicated is to do good work horizontally at any of the levels. We all have to do good work. But I think we mustn't have real difficulties obscured by pseudo difficulties.
I want to hear what Sean has to say for many reasons, one of which I haven't actually heard Sean talk for like 15 years. So it's nice to see you again, Sean. I've been trying to get better at remembering to introduce people, just in case not everyone here knows who you are. So Sean, why don't you just introduce yourself quickly? Oh, you're muted, or de facto muted.
You're muted. Oh, now you're muted. Can you unmute now? We can't hear you. This happened to Adam last time.
Yeah, he fixed it by joining with his phone. So
it happened to me too. I fixed it by exiting and entering it. Oh, I hear echo.
Are you here now, Sean?
Sorry. No, that was Melanie's echo. We can't hear you, no. Do you want to? Okay, so Do you want to invite him again? And in the meantime, Kanaka is telling me, oh.
Any luck now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Happy to
I just had to change the mic that it was using. Yeah, nice to see you, Josh. We were grad students together with Liam Paninsky, and do I want to give a year? 2005, I think. Sounds about right.
It was a good year. I think it was 2019, actually.
Oh, right. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, I'm an assistant professor at Columbia. I don't know that I have a lot of interesting or smart things to say. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Maybe just one of the very last things that was commented on. John, you said that people in neuroscience don't think they need to consult the philosophy world to get to understand what understanding is, because they think they already know it. But conversely, does it really matter to know? Like, given what most people do day in, day out, how important is a philosophically founded understanding of understanding going to change the practice of experimental neuroscience?
Well, it would get rid of a lot of silly reductionist claims that get made. In other words, it would clear up a lot. In other words, if you were going to study Drosophila, it would be because you were interested in Drosophila, not because you thought one day you'd extrapolate to human beings. So in other words, there are many ways, in my view, that being a little clearer about what explanation, understanding, extrapolation, and all these things, or even evolution, as Paul has said, it would stop the whole world, for example, studying genetically inbred mice and thinking that this is going to give us the solution. So with all due respect, I think we'd be a lot more hygienic in our thinking if we stood back a little bit, took our hands away from our cool tools, and asked ourselves what we were actually up to. And that kind of thinking doesn't go on very much, because you just have to get on with things, get your publications, and speak the general language, as Kuhn talked about. You all have to be part of the club, don't rock the boat, agree to the current vocabulary. So I'm afraid that in a way, in a kind of ironic way, that kind of question is itself proof that one should be reading more philosophy.
Well, I mean, I would say that no one is, right? At least the people that I talk to on a regular basis, they're worried, as you said, about how to get their papers into CNS.
But as Daniel Dennett has pointed out, you're always doing philosophy. There's no way. Just so I can explain what I mean, if you say, I just saw a really good paper on bioRxiv, the word good is a normative concept. There's no good variable in the paper. So as soon as you say this is a good paper, or this is an important paper, you're doing philosophy. And now you have to decide whether you want to be a little bit more thoughtful about how one uses those words, or just use them in a kind of casual way. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that one has to get a PhD in the subject. I'm just saying that one does want to clear up one's concepts a little bit and clear up one's claims. And then maybe we would have a little less vertical hyperbole.
Someone else said something in the chat, shifting gears a little bit, that I thought was interesting. You pointed out that there are these different equally valid explanations. Your dog died, your tear ducts are opening, or your brain chemistry is changing. And the comment was that they're not equally valid, that most people would agree that the answer is that your dog died. That's the explanation for why someone is upset. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, that's it's very interesting that you should be asking that, because if you look, there's a wonderful paper in Annual Review last year of Psychology on the history of psychopharmacology, right? Where psychotherapeutic explanations of depression and sadness were slowly substituted for by pharmacological theories of people's states. And in fact, as you well know, in psychiatry now, psychoanalysis is gone and psychotherapy is done by social workers. So in fact, there is a pecking order of what levels of explanation are better, all right? And, getting to Jonathan Flower's question, there are some cultures where psychosis and schizophrenia in the young is incorporated into communities, and you don't give them pharmacological therapy. So in fact, there are very strong pecking orders for what are the best explanations for the particular phenomena, unfortunately.
So, but that contrasts with what you said to us before in terms of these things all being sort of equally valid explanations. But if there's a pecking order, then at least organically in society, that's not the case.
The ideological use that different causal contrasts are put to is not my job to worry about. I'm just saying that it is going to be true, unless you're a dualist, that there is some neural, biochemical, neurotransmitter explanation for being sad, and is the one for being sad because your dog died. They're all going to be true. I mean, I just don't know what society is going to decide they prefer. For psychiatry, psychopharmacology has been far the preferred causal contrast.
Well, at least over the past 50 years.
Yes.
Sean, aren't you a psychiatrist?
I am a psychiatrist. Yeah, I am a psychiatrist. I'm a sort of a lapsed psychiatrist, although I still have my license. Yeah, I think maybe the point is that as scientists, our goal is truth, and if you're a tear duct scientist, then you're going to study the tear ducts. But that leads into a completely different topic, which is whether or not, given limited scientist resources, that they should be disposed in a way that is aligned with what society thinks is important. And I don't know that we want to open that can of worms.
Our theories should align with what society thinks is important.
No, well, I mean the development of the theories, the scientific resources, us as scientists, as resources in the scientific enterprise.
I mean, I would just say the one very simple answer to your starting question would be that I have a feeling that if we were a little bit more philosophically inclined, we'd be more pluralistic in causal contrasts, and we'd be much less likely to think that the best causal contrast is the neural circuit, which is where we currently are in neuroscience. And I feel like if we were a little bit more ecumenical, a little bit more philosophical, and a little bit more pluralistic, we'd realize that they're all good ways to explain phenomena. And what's happened is we're in the grip, based on tools, of a complete circuit mania. And that's my concern, is that we are placing one causal contrast above others for young graduate students and postdocs. And I feel that's problematic.
Do you think that I mean, bringing it almost full circle to the beginning of the conversation, that is a consequence of the fact that we have so much growth and revolution in computational fields, in computer science and statistical physics, and people who are thoughtful people want to know how they work, so they come to neuroscience and they bring the tools that they have?
Yeah, but it just suggests that there's one real meaning to the how do they work question. I was having this argument with Josh before we came on. I just feel we have to expand what we mean when we ask how does something work, and it doesn't have to boil down to neuron A banging on neuron B.
I think there's something extreme. I mean, for myself, I'll state my own biases. I'm smack in the middle of circuit mania. I think that there's enough tantalizing evidence that the computer, as more than metaphor, is a meaningful framework within which to ask and try to answer answer neuroscientific questions. And so, therefore, we look for these parallels, and we look for how to draw those lines and come up with a coherent theory of circuits. And getting back to something else that came up before about the idea of whether or not sensory motor neuroscience can inform cognitive science, the idea that certain circuit motifs come up again and again, and maybe computational building blocks with which you could deploy in different contexts. That seems like that's a very compelling idea.
Wait. Sorry, I have to take a couple of sort of moments to address a couple of things that you said. Computers, as more than metaphor, can inform circuit scientists. Yes, that's correct. We are everybody's fine with that here. Sensory motor circuits can inform cognitive science. that is the most sort of acceptable thing. No one is going to argue with that. The kind of frameworks that we have an issue with is that understanding sensory motor circuits is sufficient for understanding everything else, including everything in the prefrontal cortex, language, higher cognitive functions, etc. That reductionist view is the thing that we are disagreeing. Nobody disagrees that it can inform. Nobody disagrees that computational approaches are useful for circuit level understanding. Another thing I want to say, when we talk about philosophy, again, the way you phrase things, you say, oh, who cares about the philosophy of understanding of understanding? It's not about that. It's not about some particular papers or knowing, like John was saying, it's not about getting a PhD in philosophy. It's about a process within which one is honest about the extent of one's expertise and the reach of one's sort of subfield, right? And I think that's where I think perhaps that confusion comes up, and I appreciate and thank you for allowing us to clarify that. We are not saying that circuit science is useless. We're saying that circuitology as something that is going to overtake the entire realm of cognitive science and claims to solve everything.
As a science or as a religion?
I mean, honestly, I'm not sure at this point you can declare the religion. It will make you tax exempt at this day and age. But the thing is, and also, again, coming back, the computational models of circuits are not going to identify your dog as a cause of your dog's death as a cause of your depression. And I think that this brings us to that level of understanding again. I think I'm with you that yeah, go on.
So I just want to make one small point of quick clarification, because I am agnostic, and if you pushed me, I would say I agree with you. But I'm mostly agnostic on the point that circuit neuroscience, sensory motor circuit neuroscience, is somehow going to give us all of the keys to cognition. In fact, I'll go ahead and declare that I would bet against that. However, I think there's still so much to learn in circuitology, and that those the building blocks that we would discover from those pursuits will be useful in our ultimate discovery of cognitive phenomena. That in some ways this conversation is, well, I'm going to get in trouble here, but I'll go ahead and say it. It's premature. We have still so much to do on this sort of basic neuroscience in the industry of neuroscience as it's been articulated over the past however many decades.
But just
let me respond to that, because again, we are very clearly criticizing people who claim that if we understood such and such sensory in a rodent, we can understand everything about cognition. That will never happen. The fact that you're saying building blocks, it can be helpful, it can be useful, we're all on board with that. I mean, I'm on the committee of cosine. Like, I'm obviously I love the cosine community. I did test my models at single neuron level in humans, in patients at Columbia, in fact. So I'm definitely on board with the fact that we can learn a lot from circuits. However, that does definitely not mean that you can reduce everything at the cognitive level to circuit level, and we don't need to wait 200 centuries later to understand that. It's just simply the fact that, yes, it can be helpful. Can it solve everything? No. If we funnel all the funding and CNS publications and resources to that, is it going to be counterproductive for the future of neuroscience and AI and psychology and cognitive science? Yes, it will be.
But I want to say something to you, Sean, because you're asking really good questions, right? And I think there are just a number of things here. One is, it's very interesting that if you look at the
totally uninformed, so it's amazing.
If you look at the history of neuroscience, there really was a belief that we should go sensory motor to cognitive. Sherrington said it, right? Others. Let's just go up the neuroaxis. Let's do the spinal cord. Let's do the brainstem. And then let's go up into cortex, okay? And then there was a kind of switch. As you know, there was at Janelia, you have this mechanistic cognitive neuroscience initiative, which is saying, instead of going via sensory motor, let's keep the simple circuit, but let's call what it's doing cognitive from the get-go, okay? So it was like doing a kind of move over from going up the sensory motor chain and getting to cognition. Let's get something very simple and Sherringtonian and call it cognitive. And I have issues with that, okay? Hidden in your statement in the sensory motor is, let's get sensory motor done first, and then we can move on to cognition. It's too early to worry about cognition. So it's sort of like a neo-Sherringtonian argument. Second is the building block argument. I find the building block argument, one of the things, Melanie was on before, who's now a named professor at the Santa Fe Institute. One of the things that the Santa Fe Institute has taught me is that the physics of building blocks and the physics of the interaction of building blocks are completely different fields. Okay, so that's the deep lesson of physics, is that the interactions have a different mathematics to the individual objects. So when you say a circuit motif, you are implying that you take one circuit motif and then there are 1,000 of them, and it's some easy scaling of the initial one, and we don't have to worry about emergent interactions and qualitatively new properties. So the building block, that would be like me saying, what's the difference between a hotel and a church? Bring me the brick that built the church and bring me the brick that built the hotel, and I'll look at the two bricks and I'll be able to tell the difference. That's impossible.
That's not the right metaphor, because in this case, the bricks of the church are little hotels, right? And so I agree that if you want to construct the mega circuit, the brain, philosophy, psychology, and ultimately philosophy, from little sensory motor circuit motifs, it's going to be very challenging, and they may have very different physics. The physics of the circuit and the physics.
So the building blocks argument is all.
If you don't know what the building blocks are, can you develop the physics? Maybe, but it seems like it's not an unreasonable thing to say that it's going to be a lot harder to develop the physics at the higher level without knowing what the building.
Well, actually, that's not true. I mean, complex systems, the mathematics of complex systems work for hurricanes and traffic and ants, and there are very similar interactive descriptions which are independent of the actual elements themselves. So it's a different science.
There are great examples. I agree, but
I'm saying the building block argument is just reductionism in disguise.
Well, maybe I'm guilty.
I think both can be true. Like sometimes the building blocks are helpful and not always. Like there's an example of entropy. I read this great book called Entropy Demystified. So entropy, people understood like Boltzmann equations, things like that, before they knew about atoms. It's a perfectly fine thing. It's remarkable and brilliant that they could do it, but they also didn't need to know that they were atomic things in order to have it. So I think it can go both ways. I think John fundamentally believes that it can't go both ways, that you won't use the building blocks to inform the explanations. And I think
I'm saying that the building blocks will be reassuring, confirmatory bits of information, and it's good to know. But what I don't think is that the aggregate property that you use to explain with will have to incorporate details about the individual physical objects. That's my point.
I fully agree. I don't know if you noticed, I put in the chat before when you were talking about a similar point, that one of the most important quotes that I've remembered in my entire neuroscience career was from Bill Bialik, when he said that any good theory, the details will fall away. And the classic example is temperature and the positions of all the atoms in the room, right? Or all the molecules in the room. And so I agree. It may be that the building blocks will completely fall away and they'll be irrelevant to the theory of to some theory of cognition. But there's also, maybe, and this gets to my ignorance, as many things do. What can we do without the building blocks to build a neuroscience of cognition?
A lot,
right? I mean, are you gonna? I mean, maybe it would be good. We've been trying to persuade Ida to speak at this, and now I think that you've provoked her enough.
Persuaded by just speaking over and over again.
But I think that Ida will show you how you can have extremely useful ideas in cognitive neuroscience with causal ideas, generalizable ideas, without having to worry about building blocks. It gets to the causal contrast. They're all equally good, Sean. It's not like I'm saying get rid of them, but it seems like it's very hard to let go that there's something special about building blocks. Like it's the proper way to do it. It's not like we shouldn't have it. I agree with Josh, but we just have to let go. I mean, why did they get priority? That's what I find so fascinating.
I just really like those PCA diagrams. Those things, they're awesome. So that's kind of my whole thing.
I personally think non-negative matrix factorization is better. But
Hey, I don't care as long as you get a trajectory out of it that I can put in a paper. That's really all I care about.
No, but you actually like the best question asker in a way, because it really does get to what everyone hovers at, right? All of us in our moments feel that way too. I must admit it, even I do, right? So I just feel like we've got to somehow embrace a sort of pluralistic way of doing neuroscience. And I think it's hard to get the funders to agree to that.
Well, I really appreciate you guys letting me speak for a few minutes here. And also, I really, even though I challenged at the very beginning this whole concept, like, why do we care about having understanding? I'll tell you, this has been so much fun. And I think there should be more of this. And it's unfortunate that it's not part of day-to-day neuroscience. So.
Well, thank you, Sean. Really awesome.
Well said,
we
Sean.
can move to the next sessions also, because that perspective is we need circuitologists.
Well, I've been wanting to. I only knew about this before the previous one, which I couldn't go to. But I guess I wasn't following the Twitter as closely as I should have been, and now I'm plugged in.
The more you know. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
Sean came in. Who else is there? There was someone.
Well, John, it's 6:17.
Oh, sorry, I didn't even notice. That's fine. I'll just have a scotch.
we no longer have a sense of time in these days. It used to be that by 6 we felt tired, and now it's like 6:17, and I feel like it's 5. It's we get very into it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's really wonderful. I think it was great that everyone. And it was lovely to see former guests come in, right? Paul and Adrian and Melanie. That was really wonderful. And having Aaron come in, brought a tear to my eye to see a former postdoc just surpass. It was wonderful. So anyone else want to finish?
Murad is suggesting Abel Torres. Oh, would have been amazing. Oh, is Abel Torres here?
No, I think they're just suggesting maybe for next time.
But Abel Torres is here, and they have been discussing so far.
Mm-hmm.
I just invited Abel, so if Abel's here, then Abel can join. And then
I wanted to say about this trajectory thing. I sometimes wonder, so some of my artist friends, what they do is they look at, for instance, science books from the 70s, and then they start to analyze the pictures and the styles of images that are used to explain things. And I do wonder if there could be a very good project of analyzing the styles of images and figures that people use across different departments in computational neuro for different kinds of explanations. And Sean was right that this trajectory thing with PCA is something common in circuits.
Can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you. Hi.
Welcome.
Not sure it's enabled the sound.
We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So very shortly, because I know this is at the end of the debate, and it's just presenting a perspective purely from AI, which is the field where I'm focusing in. And when I look from the point of view of AI to these big questions of understanding, representations, and all the problems of reasoning, I look first towards neuroscience and cognitive science, trying to have more high-level guides. And the problem is that we don't have much reference of accepted theories of high-level theories of intelligence and reasoning, and that's why somehow AI field has itself created some versions of this terminology in the way it's implemented in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I wonder if we should focus more in some system-wide integrated version of intelligence, which in which we could see representations related to understanding, related to learning, and related to problem solving in a single systems. Nowadays we say, okay, what's understanding? What is the role of representations, different type of representations? We have an object, we have representation of thoughts, a representation of a language. And what I've been trying to do is to unify as much as possible this into a single system, which finds a way to find equilibrium doing multiple things at once. Is the brain, my question is the brain a collection of multiple features added one on top of the other, or is all balanced? Is system one, the so-called system one and system two, a single system? Are they independent? And that's one of the reasons I like the view of Paul as a systematic methodological approach to say, okay, I will trace, in this case, evolutionary view to reason about intelligence and see how one thing comes and is added on top of the other. And that's my search in cognitive science and neuroscience, is to find a way in which multiple mechanisms, as I mentioned, representations and learning and understanding, are dependent one from the other. And what is the state of this knowledge today?
I think that. Go on, John.
It's a big question.
Go ahead, Ida. No, Ida, it's a big question. Ida, you take.
So since it's 6:23 and we're about to wind down, I thought you had a sort of a more focused question about one of the specific points. I just want to say that this salon in general is related to all of the questions that you just asked. And we hope that every session and these wrap-up sessions help to address them. You're totally right that the brain has very different features, and there are different levels of understanding and analysis. And the relationship between them is something we do want to understand. I'm not sure I can give a more precise answer than that, but I leave it to Jovo.
Thanks. Yeah, that's an easy one. I'll just take that in the 3 minutes left. I think it's a really important question, and just like you said, Paul's ideas are related to other ideas. That it's really easy in neuroscience for us to say, oh yeah, we're going to explain reasoning or cognition or whatever. And I mentioned this before. There's that Twitter account that just adds "in mice" after the publication titles because people study something and they just say, now we understand decision making, but it's like "in mice" or "in flies" or whatever. And I think it is incumbent upon us to do a better job in clarifying the thing that we're trying to explain, which is almost always going to be a small part of that system. And the goal that you're ascribing is saying that maybe we could try to figure out this bigger, more comprehensive system. I just think it's really hard, and there's been lots of people who've tried to do that. There's a whole book, Large Scale Theories of the Brain, and then Rajesh Rao has this Bayesian brain book, and there's lots of other ones like that. I find them to be mostly unsatisfying in the sense of, as you try to explain too much, I find that you often explain too little. And so I'm more of a reductionist in terms of the questions, like let's explain this part of cognition with circuits, obviously, but or not, as the case may be. And I think that's going to be more profitable in the short term until we have a better grasp of things. But certainly other people are free to do it other ways. And if you can make progress like that, it's amazing.
One of the interesting things about, Ida sent me a paper by Bengio on does AI need a prefrontal cortex, right? And one of the interesting things as a neurologist that you see in patients with prefrontal damage is how unbelievably modular cognition is, right? In other words, that even when you start thinking you're going to get to some general intelligence, right, it begins to break into pieces, right? So I to say, as to what Josh said, I don't know we're going to have a universal theory of anything. I'm not sure. It may be that you make it out of the same bricks, but what each brick does in its module is qualitatively special, right? So I struggle with a universal theory, like, as I've criticized the Fristonian kind of universal theory. To me, that's much more about energetics and adaptation than it is about cognition. So I don't know if there's going to be one. I don't know. Maybe biology just isn't subject to universals the way physics is. I don't know.
I think that's a great point to end on. We have the next several salons to figure out the answer. Thank you, Abel. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, everyone. We are getting requests to make a learning salon merchandise. If anybody wants to volunteer to help us do that, please do. We will have
logos, everything.
We'll have neo-Sherringtonian circuitologists.
Circuitmania.
Oh no, you're
my WrestleMania shirts.
Brian, you're muted. You're still muted?
It's an act of God.
You're muted, John.
I
unmuted you. I unmuted you.
Shut up. You too. I'm going to go on strike. Are we in the room still, or can we just go be there on our own?
We're still live, I think.
We're still live. We have to say goodbye.
Well, bye-bye.
Everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're very happy to have you all here. Join us next time. We're going to have John Langford next time. And we're going to talk about reinforcement learning and AI. We look forward for everybody to join us. And yeah, thank you, Kanaka. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Eva, our behind-the-scene notorious team, without whom we will probably fall apart. And thank you for everyone who participated and was in the living room on stage. I feel like we're doing a lot better every week, and I really appreciate the chat. I hope someone saved everything because I missed a lot of things. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.